大家好，欢迎收看人民网英国公司视频访谈节目。今天我们非常荣幸地邀请到英国著名的48家集团主席 Stephen Perry 先生来和我们进行交流。Stephen, it's really nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Yeah, we have heard so much things about you and the 48 Group Club. Maybe you can give us a brief introduction about the club to our audience.
Sure. I mean, it all started 60-some years ago when some Cambridge professors invited my father to dinner, and he didn't realize it. One of the people at the dinner, who was Chinese, actually came from Beijing. He thought he was from America or somewhere like that. And they enjoyed a very good conversation. They all had generally progressive points of view, so they had some perceptions of the world in common. And it was the beginning of the Cold War period, and after that dinner, this Chinese gentleman, his name is Chi, called my father from Switzerland, asked him to go over and talk to him. He said, why? And he said, because I'd like to talk to you about getting involved in business with China. Anyway, my father went because he liked to go to Switzerland and enjoyed the conversation, and then he agreed to meet and talk with them more at the Moscow Economic Conference in April of '52, and then they invited him to get involved in helping to reopen China's trade with the West, which he did, signed an agreement in July '52, changed his business direction altogether, took a big risk, but so did the Chinese. And then the next year, in 1953, he took the first group of British business people to Beijing. And they were attacked by some people because this was the time of the boycotts and sanctions and so on. And some people encouraged the idea. But generally speaking, there was more negative than positive. But my father was quite a tough guy. He could take the attacks that came on him. And the Chinese side lived up to their word. They said, we will restore our foreign trade, and if you have confidence in us, we'll get this right together. So they had to work out how to deal with a country in chaos. I mean, China was in a terrible condition at that time. So the idea of getting 10 tons of tea from Guangxi to a port and to England for mixing with other teas, for making tea for the British people, just seemed impossible. But they did it. And today it's so easy to do. But in those days, they were really going against the tide in a big way, and they really enjoyed it because people found it very difficult to accept letters of credit from Bank of China, and they said we don't trust that letter of credit for buying things to take into China, and so they convinced one man in the end in the wool business to sell wool to China and take a Chinese letter of credit, and everything went through smoothly. And Bank of China was back again at the center of trade between China and the West, as it had been for many years before. So that whole period was one of great excitement, great difficulties, and they came through it, Chinese and British. They worked out the ways to reopen the trade. Silk, tea, bristles, casings, all sorts of things, chemicals and machines coming in. And that's what I joined into many years later, but it was my dad and his generation that opened the doors.
Wow. What's the full name of your father?
Jack Perry.
Jack Perry.
Yeah, he was I think the main pioneer of it all.
I would say probably in a more Chinese way, we'll say your father and you have really made history.
Maybe my father. I tried to follow it. It's different times I've operated in. I've had challenges and difficulties, but it was different. What my father had to deal with. You know, when my father went to China, it took 7 days to get from London to Hong Kong, 3 days from Hong Kong to Beijing. They had to ford across rivers. Everywhere there was problems of disease, malnutrition, poverty. I've seen some of that in the early 70s, but nothing like what he saw in the early 50s. And for me, it's a constant reminder of the transformation of China. And when people make generalizations about Mao Zedong and things like that, I think you really don't understand where China's come from. I was very lucky, and my father was very lucky, because we both had the chance to know Joseph Needham, the professor at Cambridge, who wrote The Science and Civilization of China. And he taught us a lot about the very deep and rich history and civilization of China. So, if we've made history, it's because China's made history.
I think you're already part of history, and you have been a great contributor to the better links between China and Britain. So when did you first visit China, and what's your first impression about China?
Goodness me. I mean, I'd been working with my father on and off in holidays and so on from the early 60s, but my first trip was 72. I was a student leader, and I stopped doing that, and the next morning I flew to China with my mother and father. We landed in Shanghai. That was the first place we landed in. And then we took another plane to go to Beijing. We were on the same plane as Mintoff, the Prime Minister of Malta.
Oh, really?
Probably the smallest country in the world.
Wow.
And in Shanghai and in Beijing, there was thousands of people singing and dancing and welcoming him. And what was it about? He was resistant to NATO in the Mediterranean, and China treated him as a very good friend. And I realized then that it didn't matter whether you were big or small. China's approach to the world was political. Once it had made an assessment that we're friends, then it didn't matter whether you had a big checkbook, small checkbook, whether you were very powerful or not so powerful, you still had a role and a reception from the Chinese. It made quite a deep impression. Other than that was the recognition that everything in China stopped when it got dark, started when it got light, that the land was grown to the edge of the railway line, whatever. There was no space wasted. There were very few cars. Goodness me, I bet you can't imagine that.
Do you think, you still have the impression there are so many people riding on a bicycle?
Oh, in those days, not even so many bicycles. Oh, really? The bicycles really took off more after that time. There was bicycles, of course, but a lot of people walked, crammed into buses. It was difficult to access China. Forever as a young person I wanted to get behind the scenes and go into the countryside. But the access was very interesting but very controlled in those days.
How old was you when you first visited China?
24.
24?
Yeah.
And at that young age you already started to change the very important course between two countries.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether I knew then that I was going to play a public role between UK and China. At that time I was trying to understand the business that my father had, that he wanted me to take over to run. And I had ideas about the world, we all do when we're young, and about everything like that. I don't think I knew that I would actually take a more prominent role as I did, I guess, really from the time when the Hong Kong crisis happened.
But you have been to China many, many times since 1972.
Yeah.
And I remember that recently in July you have brought a delegation with you to visit Beijing again.
Yeah.
So what's your new experience this time?
This was the anniversary of the 60 years since the first icebreaker mission went into China. And it was a very reflective moment for me and for all of us, because we remembered Jack Perry, Roland Berger, Percy Timberlake, Todd Sloan, Bernard Buckman, a variety of people who had made their contribution. Lord Boydore was a leading person, Joan Robinson. We remembered them, and we remembered the steps that they had taken, a very brave and very profound impression that they made. And as I walked up the steps of the Great Hall of the People, I had a sense of, this was not the first time I'd done that, I'd done it several times over the years, and I had a vision as I looked out over Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City of the enormous transformation that's occurred in China. So there was a sense of history back 60 years, but it was like a moving picture for me of all the changes that the city had engaged in and that the country had engaged in these 60 years. It was quite special. Unfortunately, it's the kind of thing you can only do when you're a bit older and you wish you were a bit younger.
I see. But I'm sure, people really appreciate the great efforts you have been making over the years, try to ensure the dialogue on both sides are going on smoothly, no matter how the overall political environment is, It
is, it's an interesting challenge which came to me I think I was involved in business for about 20, 25 years before I began to take a more active role in the wider dimensions. But it was clear to me all along that very few people, I don't mean this in an arrogant way, that I'm cleverer than other people. I had the good fortune to know the friends of my father and the children of the friends of my father. And I'm talking here about foreigners who lived in China, their families. I didn't know so many Chinese. But from them I was able to gather a lot of understanding about where China had come from, and therefore where China was going to. And I think the problem most people have is they judge China on what they see today. They don't have the opportunity of the perspective that I had because I concentrated on China. So if I have more perspective, it's for that reason.
And also another thing is which interests a lot of people at this moment is probably how the UK, especially London, is going to play a future role in the internationalization of the Chinese currency RMB, especially when the Bank of China and the Bank of England have signed the £21 billion swap agreement for the currency in June this year. So what do you see will be the next big opportunities, especially for small, medium-sized enterprise on both sides to grab this really important opportunity?
Yeah, well, who would ever have thought that one would describe 20 billion as a small figure? But it is, by comparison to what it will be, it is a small figure. Look, the British are probably the greatest nation of traders in the world. The British are certainly a great nation of financiers, of how to fund and develop international business. So I think from the Chinese side, having the British as partners in their going global makes a lot of sense. And there's probably more to do between Britain and China in other countries than there is inside Britain. And Britain is very, very international. And the British stock market, 80% of its profits come from overseas. We are very international, very global, and you have more experience and professional skills in London than in most capitals in the world. So you then ask the question, what is the opportunity for the SMEs? I think for the Chinese SMEs, it's very simple. China's going to have to contain the enthusiasm of its SMEs because there's a reputation to risk. That they may go out and try and do too much and get involved in things which are inappropriate. But Chinese SMEs will have a great time going out into the world economy, developing business, two-way business, and creating more growth and prosperity. For the bigger companies, the opportunities are there as well. Major, significant, dynamic opportunities to buy into global firms, British firms, whatever. For the British, going into China is more difficult. The SMEs, yes. But the British have to refine their ability to help the SMEs operate in China, and it's in the Chinese interest to help British companies operate inside China. More people in China speak English than in England, but the number of English people who speak Chinese is very few. So for the British to go into China, it's more difficult than for the Chinese to go into Britain or into Europe. But the British are a nation of traders, and we may enjoy a glass of beer and a football, but at the end of the day, we've got to pay the bills. And how do you pay the bills? By doing business. And so the SMEs have got to get on the planes, and they've got to go out there, like the 48 Group did 60 years ago, and blaze their way into the Chinese market. I will make this prediction, that China will allow the foreigners much greater access to the Chinese domestic market over the next 25 years than people expect. And for the SMEs who go from Britain to China over the next 10 or 15 years, the rewards will be very significant. But the work will not be easy. China is a complex country with a lot of different cultures, a lot of different dialects, a lot of different ways of doing business, and you have to be up for those challenges. If you want a simple task, go and sell ice creams in Bournemouth. China is not like that. It's a different challenge. But I think more and more we're a multicultural society. people here really want to access the Chinese market. Who's one of our greatest developers of the Chinese market in the last 5-7 years? It's Jaguar and Land Rover, and they're Indian owned. So we have this very unusual situation of where we're very comfortable with foreigners coming into our country, owning the majority of the shares, even all the shares in a company, so long as they employ the British, they work hard, and they pay their taxes. And I think that will be something that China is looking at and will look at more and more. And that will create more and more opportunity for SMEs, as well as big companies, to integrate their businesses closer and closer to each other. I'm kind of optimistic.
I really like your idea about, China and Britain should establish a more strategic partnership to access a third country or other regions in the world. Are there any key markets you think might be the starting point, say Commonwealth countries or ASEAN or maybe Africa, Latin America?
I think the propellant in all of this is China. So you have to look first at what is China trying to do. China's trying to assure itself of its raw material needs going forward, and in the process is creating higher added value markets for its goods, which goes all the way through to retailing. So you've got some very interesting things happening, particularly in Africa, where there is a great deal of raw materials. And the Chinese are developing many of those for their own use, but they're also finding that the Africans increasingly want to develop those raw materials themselves inside their own country, and the Chinese are finding that they also can take these goods up to higher and higher levels before they ship them either to China or to goods or to destinations around the world. So I think in a wide variety of areas of raw materials, and the processing upwards from those raw materials, particularly in Africa, there are great opportunities between the British and Chinese. There are opportunities in Asia, there are opportunities in Latin America. But those two continents are more confused from the point of view of the British and Chinese being able... Well, if you take Asia, Asia is very well developed by a number of Asian nations. It's not at the lower level of development that Africa is at. South America has more in common in some respect with Africa, but it's also got a long history of relationship with America, with Spain, with Portugal, with other countries like that. And those countries also have some internal contradictions which make it more difficult to work inside those countries. Whereas Africa is quite open to resource development. And I would say that if you take a situation like cotton, where China grows 7 million tons of cotton, and I think it will grow 3 million tons of cotton in 10 years' time, they will switch from cotton to food. It makes sense. Why grow cotton in China when you may have to feed your people? You grow food in China. So you've got to go and find 3 million tons of cotton in the world market. Where would you go? Well, the best place is Africa. So, and if you're growing cotton in Africa, then you might as well spin it in Africa. And you might as well make garments in Africa. And who has the best understanding of Africa? I think it's probably the British. It's very easy for us to be arrogant. But there's the British, the French, the Americans, the Germans possibly. But I think of those nations, I think that in the countries where the British were, there are the best conditions for the Chinese to prosper. So I think there are a lot of big British companies with major investments in Africa that will increasingly find they can change their relationship with the Chinese globally developing corporations by giving them percentages of equity in their African operations. I think the synergy will most be felt in Africa between Britain and China.
So Africa, it will be the future for key collaboration.
I think it will be the greatest catalyst of them all. But that's just a personal prediction.
But I think, obviously there has been so many interesting, discussion from a more international perspective about investing in Africa, and not only about reducing poverty, about some basic, human issues, but probably more about how to support the long-term sustainable development for Africa as a whole continent. From, China, from I mean, the latest, World Economic Forum in Switzerland, and also America has been trying to, catching up lots of investment opportunities in Africa.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese want what Africa has got. They get what being a developing nation is about. They understand that if you try and take short-term power over people, it doesn't lead anywhere good. China knows that from its own experience. So they can develop policies that are very suitable to Africa. The problem for China is its entrepreneurs. They won't have the same values and principles that the government of China has developed because they don't have the same experience. So this is what I said before. In these areas, China is going to have a very solid mechanism for regulating its companies in Africa to make sure that they stay to the principles which I believe the government really holds true to and really means. That will be an important part of the whole process. But 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land is in Africa.
Oh, really?
Yes. So Africa is a very important continent for China. And the people of Africa can have their lives transformed by the interests of China. The Chinese find it very hard to understand the Africans. They don't have networks in Africa. The British do. The British understand the Africans and they understand the networks. Some of that's because we didn't treat them right in the past. We don't have a very great history over the last 200-300 years. But today, we're quite realistic about how to work with Africa. So I think there is a synergy there.
That's really great. And also another interesting question is there has been lots of discussion about the UK's membership to the EU. And also there has been some people who are proposing to probably create a pan-Commonwealth free trade agreement, which will be probably more exciting than the current EU agreement. So between the choice of a European-wide free trade agreement and the Commonwealth ones, do you think there is a way we could potentially try to achieve both, or do you think how realistic that will be?
It's a profound question, and I don't mean that patronizingly, but the origin of the question is around the failure of the Doha round. The Doha round failed in Hong Kong because America and Europe wouldn't give up subsidizing agriculture in exchange for the access they wanted in developing nations. I think the United States and Europe set themselves on a path then which was going to lead to problems for themselves. The Chinese immediately went to bilateral free trade agreements, ASEAN and a number of others across the world, and took advantage of the opportunity that people wanted to have more trade, and the Chinese opened their market and they gave people in return. There was a reciprocal approach to the whole thing. The Americans and the Europeans took a long time to realize that the world was changing around them. And now you have the Americans looking at creating TPPA, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a free trade agreement as well between America and Europe, and you have this idea of a Commonwealth free trade area. They're all good ideas, but they are all more limiting than the original concepts of WTO. So we appear to be in a post-WTO world now, where some are trying to create protectionist, smaller free trade areas. I don't think that they will succeed in the long term. They may happen in the short term. Who knows, Britain could vote to leave the European Union. What a disastrous mistake that would be. For the last 1,000 years, the Europeans have been killing each other, except for in the last 60 years when we've had the European Union. So from a political point of view, it makes no sense for us to leave the European Union. But it is possible, and we could have a pan-Commonwealth free trade area. But these are ideas. Are we really going to give up something we understand and know about in exchange for something that might develop and give away? And how do we know the people in the Commonwealth countries really want a relationship with us? So I think it's important in all of this to understand the roots of where this is coming from. And I think the concept of the WTO was a good one. It was a regulatory organization which would enhance the development of global markets. And I think the Europeans and Americans need to go back to the question of subsidizing agriculture. Very difficult for both of them for internal political reasons, but I think they would be far better to rearm WTO in a way that provides more success for the Europeans and Americans, and I think that will make some of these regional free trade agreements become redundant. But for the moment, people are looking at regional free trade agreements.
My last question today is about the Chinese dream. You know, especially with the new President Xi Jinping, you know, took over. You know, he came out with a really exciting new ideas about what it means to have a Chinese dream. And recently there has been a new book published. I mean, in mainland China is trying to proposing that a Chinese dream is a dream that's not only going to benefit, you know, Chinese citizens who are living in mainland China or, you know, elsewhere around the world, but also for, you know, foreigners who might be looking for more opportunity in the Chinese, you know, market. So what does Chinese dream mean to you?
I think the Chinese dream is long overdue, and I think it's very difficult to conclude what it might be. I think it's excellent that people are talking about it and working it out. But if you say, look at the West, and you say, what is the value basis for Western values? It is essentially the Bible. The Bible. That's where the values of Western society were encoded and given out through religious means. But if you ask me what drives me, that's the origin of it. Caring, thoughtfulness, looking after people less prosperous than you, and all these different things. They all come initially from the Bible, which was a codification of values. If you ask the same question about China, it's more difficult to define. There are lots of different influences: Buddhism, Marxism, Taoism. There are several different influences on the Chinese, Confucius. In the end, you have to try and bring all of these together into a coherent whole that says to the Chinese people, and by the Chinese people to the rest of the world, this is really who we are, why we are, what we are. That is the most important part of the Chinese dream. China has been corrupted by money. There is a problem of corruption in China, but much more significant than that is the corruption of the Chinese soul. As you prioritize economic development, so people become preoccupied by money, creating wealth and ambition. And all across the board, this change in Chinese values has occurred. Now, the Chinese dream should recenter a lot of that. It should say to Chinese leaders, you're lucky you're a leader. Don't try and make money out of it as well. That's not what you're here for. You're here to give leadership, to give example. And you say to business, your job is here to develop and grow the Chinese economy, and you're entitled to have benefits for yourselves, but be caring about the people of China. In the end, the set of values are not that different between the inherent values of the Chinese system and the inherent values of the Western system. But I think it needs a codification in the form of a Chinese dream. Well, people in the West, I don't know, people in the West started going to India in the 60s when I was a young man, looking for the answers to the world's questions. I don't think they found them. I don't think the Beatles found the answers in India. So I think that the Chinese dream will be of great interest to people around the world, and will help many of us see some questions in a different light. But the greatest value of the Chinese dream is that it will codify for the Chinese people who they are, why they are, what they want to be, and how it all works together. I think it's a great thing that is happening now. Time is absolutely right.
Thank you so much. It has been absolutely fantastic talking to you to get such in-depth knowledge on a wide range issue of politics, business, trade, and culture. Thank you so much, Stephen. Nice to see you.